we will go through a bit of a presentation that I've got going on. I know there's going to be 100 questions, but that's okay. Let's get started anyway. So today, I am Georgia Hartman. I'm a naturopath. I'm a nutritionist. I founded the business Hormone Health Studio, and we really focus on supporting you throughout preconception, pregnancy, and your postpartum journey. So predominantly women, but of course it takes two to tango in that process. So lots of couples come through our community. A bit of a personal insight into who I am. Aside from being a naturopath and nutritionist, I have my own fertility journey. I was diagnosed with premature ovarian failure in my early 20s, which basically is early menopause. So my FSH was through the roof, my estrogen was through the floor, my AMH, which is a marker of your egg count, was less than 1. So I had all of these hormonal imbalances. And through that journey, as stressful as it is, and I'm not sure, but perhaps some of you here have been through your own fertility journey, but you can come out the other side learning so much about yourself, about your hormones, and about the process and how hard it actually is, for that sperm to meet that egg and to fertilize and create a healthy baby. So I did go on to conceive my first child naturally against all odds. I remember sitting across from an IVF specialist who said that I don't even qualify for IVF considering all of my hormonal imbalances. I'm here to tell you that there's so many things that you can do for your hormones, particularly in terms of diet, in terms of lifestyle, and of course in terms of supplements. So let's look a little into our hormones. Everything we do affects our hormones, which in turn affects everything we do. We have over 200 different hormones in the body, and they're produced by several different glands and organs. And in fact, today I will go through the 3 main axes that I educate the women and couples in my clinic about. But the whole purpose of hormones is that they reach a target site, they bind to a receptor in that target site, much like a key into a lock, right? And then once that key is in the lock and unlocks the lock, the door opens and hormones can function as they are, and they can do the job that they're meant to do. So why do we need hormones? Aside from the obvious, fertility, having a baby, having a menstrual cycle, our hormones do so much more. Our hormones regulate our body temperature and how hungry and thirsty we are. They are implicated in blood pressure and how balanced our weight is. They affect our mood, our energy, our hair growth, our sleep. You can see everything listed here. Our libido, which is often a big one I'm speaking to women about in my clinic. Hormones are required for almost everything. I could be a little biased in my approach, but they play a huge role in how you feel day to day. So how are they made? The key hormones that I really want to pinpoint in this slide are estrogen and testosterone. So here are 2 different forms of estrogen, and here is testosterone. These are our sex hormones, right? And you can see they all come from cholesterol. So what happens in a normal, healthy hormonal pathway is that you get cholesterol from food, and cholesterol comes from fat, right? So avocados, coconut, good healthy fats. It comes down to pregnenolone and then down to DHEA. And then you can see this conversion pathway whereby it makes estrone, testosterone, and another type of estrogen, which is predominant in reproductive age women, named estradiol. This is nice, healthy. That's a nice, healthy pathway, right? However, what can often happen is something called the pregnenolone steal, whereby, sure, we've had adequate cholesterol, but then something happens along here. Stress. Heightened, prolonged stress, whereby we make excess levels of our corticosteroids, in particular cortisol, which are created by the adrenal glands, and we'll go through that. I have a little diagram. But what happens in this scenario is that in cases of high stress, rather than making our nice levels of estrogen and testosterone, we just make more cortisol. And this is what's called the pregnenolone steal, and this is a big reason as to why stress affects your hormonal balance. The other thing I wanted to mention here is that cholesterol comes from fat, right? So if you're following a low fat diet, which, as we know, has been around for years and years and years and has been a big fad diet, particularly when it comes to weight loss, what actually happens when you have a low fat diet is that you don't even have the building block to make these adequate levels of estrogen and testosterone. So I urge you, eat your fats, love your fats, your healthy fats, right? There's different types of fats. You can get trans fats, which are your fried foods, your donuts, your takeaway foods, all of the unhealthy fats. But you can also get omega-3 fatty acids and saturated fatty acids, which you get from fatty fish, salmon, tuna, sardines. You get them from things like avocado and coconut oil, like I mentioned. So cholesterol, we need for hormones. Fat, we need for hormones. So let's talk a bit about the key players. These are the 3 axes that I'm going to go into depth about. So the first axis here is called the HPA axis. This refers to the communication between the hypothalamus, the pituitary, and the adrenal glands. The hypothalamus and the pituitary are little glands that sit in your brain, right behind your eyes here. What they do is they're responsible in this axis to communicate with your adrenal glands, 2 glands that sit on top of your kidneys here, as you can see. When this axis is working properly, you have a nice, healthy stress response. You can enter situations, like a deadline at work or a confrontational conversation or whatever the stressor may be. You can enter that situation and you can be quite resilient and respond quite well. However, what often happens with this axis is that it's activated all of the time. We're highly stressed, head in hands, pulling hair out, not sleeping, completely anxious, waking up with palpitations. We're too stressed all of the time and there's no break. What's actually happening in this axis when that happens is that our hypothalamus is screaming. With our hypothalamus, it cannot differentiate between the stress of a deadline at work, the stress of, financial stress or a relationship stress, or the stress of running away from a lion in sub-Saharan Africa. And in fact, it will react the exact same way. And it will say, okay, we need to run away from this lion. So let's spend all of our energy, send it to the big muscles so that we can get away from this stressful moment. What happens in that situation is a really big impact on the HPO axis. So the HPO axis refers similarly to the communication between the hypothalamus, the pituitary, and the ovaries. In men, it's the gonads. And what happens in this scenario is that, particularly if there is that high stress, the hypothalamus says, okay, well, we're running away from this lion. The last thing we want to do right now is bring a baby into the world. So let's shut off the reproductive system, so to speak. And like I mentioned, send that energy to our big muscles so that we can run away and just survive the next minute. So particularly when it comes to menstrual cycle function, to PMS, to PMDD, which is the severe form of PMS with anxiety and depression, which is, I see that quite frequently in women, that week or so before their period, really anxious and then fluctuating to really low depressed mood. I also see that high stress affecting obviously fertility, but other reproductive conditions such as PCOS and irregular cycles and endometriosis. The stress is making the pain worse in women with endo, which my sister has stage 4 endo, and many times I've seen her vomiting in the shower in pain. So it's already a condition with heightened levels of internal stress. Additional stress just makes the whole situation worse. What also happens with this axis is that when it's functioning normally, what happens is that the hypothalamus tells the pituitary, which is a little gland below it, to secrete the hormones FSH and LH, follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. These hormones then tell the ovaries to make estrogen and progesterone. Why is this important? Well, Estrogen lifts you up. It's your happy, strong hormone, and progesterone calms you down. It's your calming, soothing hormone. So when these hormones are in balance, that's exactly how you should feel. You should feel happy and strong, but calm. There shouldn't be any premenstrual mood swings or premenstrual anxiety. You should feel quite centered. The only way, though, that we can have adequate levels of estrogen and progesterone naturally is to ovulate. And ovulation, I mean, I feel like I'm having this conversation 10, 15, 20 years too late. And maybe that's where my business will go. I need to get into schools and speak to the girls. But ovulation is the big event. It's the one hormonal question you need to ask yourself. Are you ovulating? And if the answer is I don't know, let me explain to you what ovulation is. Ovulation is a process that happens mid-cycle, right? So you have day one of your bleed, that's day one of your cycle. And then halfway through, around aboutish, there is ovulation. And then at the end, that is when you keep counting until the first day of your next period, and that's your cycle length. For ovulation to occur, it's a process that happens over 100 days. So think the last 3.5, 4 months. So what happens is that you get follicles and they grow and grow and grow and grow. And eventually you get one dominant follicle that's ruptured by the ovary. That's ovulation. And then the ovary kind of reabsorbs the rest of them and the whole process starts again. It's fascinating. The whole point about knowing if you ovulate is that because it takes 100 days for these follicles to develop, anything that you've experienced in that last 3.5, 4 months will affect your cycle today. So think, have you been highly stressed? Have you been under eating or overeating? Have you not been exercising? Have you been drinking too much alcohol or caffeine, or what has been going on in that last 3.5, 4 months that could be causing your symptoms today? And this is key, particularly when you're experiencing, say, PMS, and you're thinking, I never get moody before my period. What is happening this cycle? And you just kind of think about, okay, well, what's happened the last few days? But instead, take a step back and think, what's happened the last 100 days? And how can that be affecting my cycle today? Knowing that is handy because particularly when it comes to your period, I don't know, it kind of takes the weight off your shoulders and, you stop thinking, oh, I'm crazy, something's going wrong, I'm not in control of my body. But in fact, you go, oh, actually, I partied pretty hard last month. Is that what has been causing this cycle to be so different? The other thing too, when it comes to making your own levels of estrogen and progesterone from a hormonal standpoint and in terms of symptoms, if you experience difficulty shifting weight around the belly, if you have heavy periods, painful periods, the big PMS, headaches before your period, these could all be symptoms of estrogen excess, right? And on the flip side of that, when it comes to progesterone, if you're not making enough progesterone, you could be experiencing symptoms of spotting, particularly before your period, tender breasts before your period, or premenstrual anxiety. I mean, there's many things. You can get gut dysfunction, particularly bloating. That's also an imbalance in estrogen and progesterone. But it's important to know that, our cycle and our hormones are so much more than a bleed each month. Like I mentioned before, they affect our mood, they affect our energy, our sleep, how well we feel as a woman. And this third axis here is called the HPT axis. So right here, this here is the thyroid. It's a butterfly-shaped gland that sits right at the base of your throat. And this axis refers to the communication between the hypothalamus, the pituitary, and the thyroid gland. Now, when it comes to thyroid health, it's probably one of the most common dysfunctions that I see in my clinic. And in terms of symptoms, they vary and you can swing from an underactive thyroid to an overactive thyroid. It's just sensitive. It's the most sensitive gland in the body. So in terms of an underactive thyroid, and I would see this much more commonly, symptoms of, again, difficulty shifting weight. I mean, from a hormonal standpoint, that could come from the thyroid, it could come from estrogen, it could also come from something called insulin, which is created by the pancreas. Nonetheless, if your thyroid is underactive, aside from the weight, energy, like you're just so fatigued, and it's that type of fatigue that irrespective of how much sleep you've had, you wake up tired, you're tired all day, and then perhaps at 9 p.m. you get this weird second wind of energy, which is the worst time to get it. And then you struggle getting to sleep, and then the whole cycle starts over again. You can also have dry skin, dry hair, brittle nails, foggy mind, poor concentration, irregular cycles, difficulty conceiving, miscarriage history. These are all classic symptoms of an underactive thyroid. On the flip side of that, your thyroid can be overactive. And think if the underactive is all really kind of slow and sluggish, the overactive is the opposite. You can be anxious, you can have palpitations, you can sweat excessively, you can have diarrhea, you can have like big everything's just really fast. So the important thing to know about the thyroid, though, is that it is so sensitive to two things in particular. It's so sensitive to how much sleep you get, and it's so sensitive to the amount of stress that's going on in your life. And I will see it. I commonly test thyroid function. It's a simple blood test. And as soon as I see a result and I think, gosh, what's happened there? This thyroid has just swung out of nowhere. And I'll ask the question, what's been happening? And it'll be something incredibly stressful that's gone on, which has then affected sleep. And then that's what caused the thyroid to get out of whack. So those are the three axes that I work on predominantly in clinic. I mean, there's many nutrients, there's many herbal medicines, and like we spoke about, lifestyle, dietary factors play a huge role. So the question is, how can you start balancing your hormones? I mean, it's quite sciencey, once you go into the different axes and how they work, but let's just strip it back and get the basics right. When it comes to the HPA axis and the HPO axis, so the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal and hypothalamic pituitary ovarian, or gonadal in men and women, this is what we need to do. And this is what you can start doing today. You can move your body. You can avoid excessive consumption of stimulants, in particular caffeine. Caffeine's interesting when you start looking at the research. I have the best coffee machine in my house and I love it. So I will be first to say that I am all for caffeine. But what can often happen is that too much caffeine exacerbates your feelings of stress and anxiety. So if you're already stressed or already anxious or already have this sense of just general overwhelm, caffeine exacerbates that. And so that's where looking at, okay, well, what am I putting into my body and how is this affecting my feelings of stress and anxiety? Sleep. At least 7 hours per night. If you are a mum like me, at least 7 hours of disrupted sleep. Or perhaps if you can rest during the day, maybe, my son Otto is now 14 or 15 months, but in the very early newborn days, I would lay down when he sleeps. Some days I may not sleep myself, but phone down, resting, and 20 minutes of that was enough to recharge me to get through until the next nap. Other things like meditation, massage, great for relaxation. If yoga is a part of your daily exercise, then great, perfect, particularly if you're feeling stressed, anxious, burnt out. And then from a dietary perspective, there's particular foods and particular nutrients that I look at and I make sure are incorporated from a dietary standpoint to support the HPA and to support the HPO axes. Magnesium is probably the first nutrient you need to look at. And it pops back over here too when it comes to thyroid function. But magnesium, it's involved in dampening that HPA response, so dampening that release of cortisol. When it comes to the HPO axis, it's key in supporting estrogen metabolism and balancing that estrogen progesterone ratio. So look at the food that are high in magnesium, leafy green vegetables, spinach in particular, but also things like cacao, rich in magnesium. Often if you're craving chocolate, like you just cannot stop craving chocolate. It's more than a willpower thing. It's like a deep internal metabolic craving. It's often your body telling you you're deficient in magnesium because chocolate is super rich in magnesium. I definitely am not recommending chocolate being a staple when it comes to supporting your HPA and HPO axes. The reason being that the sugar and the caffeine content often outweigh the benefit of the magnesium. But nonetheless, my point is tuning into those cravings and figuring out what they actually mean. Other foods that are high in magnesium, though, pumpkin seeds or pepitas and almonds. And I mean, you can get these in daily. You could do a spinach smoothie and get it all in one hit. We also need to make sure that we've got adequate amount of protein, carbohydrates, and healthy fats with your meals. So fats, remember, that's where we get cholesterol. So that's how we're going to make our sex hormones, in particular estrogen and testosterone. But when it comes to protein and carbohydrates, these in particular support your hypothalamus. Remember, the hypothalamus, remember how I mentioned it cannot differentiate between the stress of a work deadline, the stress of financial stress, the stress of running away from a lion. It also doesn't know whether the stress of undereating is the same as all of that. So if you're undereating, it can also affect the HPO axis and cause an absent cycle or irregular cycles. This is a condition called hypothalamic amenorrhea. Hypothalamic, referring to your hypothalamus, amenorrhea, meaning loss of cycle. So making sure that you've got the staple macronutrients, your protein, which you get from meat and chicken and eggs and nuts and seeds and legumes, carbohydrates, which you get from some vegetables. I mean, vegetables are carbohydrates. You can get higher carbohydrate vegetables, such as your potato, sweet potato, pumpkin, but also rice and pasta and bread. I mean, we have such a negative attitude towards bread and pasta, don't we? But in order to have hormonal balance and a bit of enjoyment in life, we need them. And then, of course, having healthy relationships. You know, is there that toxic relationship or that toxic boss or whatever it may be that's causing you the stress? Get rid of them. Simple as that. When it comes to the HPT axis, so again, this is more talking about the thyroid function. Like I said, the two biggest factors are stress and sleep. So making sure that you're addressing both of those areas to support your thyroid, and then we can turn to the food. There's 5 key nutrients that are involved in supporting your thyroid function. Those are iodine, selenium, magnesium, zinc, and tyrosine. And so you can see here some of the foods that are listed that are rich in those nutrients, and you can add those into your daily diet and know that that will be supporting your thyroid. And like I mentioned, in terms of the symptoms, because the thyroid can fluctuate all of the time from an underactive state to an overactive state, depending on your symptoms, get the testing. And testing for thyroid function is really straightforward. Simple blood testing. At the moment, I will test, the main hormone is TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. And in Australia, you can test that quite easily on Medicare. And then if that marker comes back out of range, Medicare will say, okay, now we can do free T3, free T4, antibodies, or whatever it may be. However, one thing to know about thyroid testing is that if you test TSH or thyroid stimulating hormone, the reference range is something like 0.5 to 4.5. If you are 2.5 or higher, so still within the range, but on that higher end, that's what's classified as subclinical hypothyroidism. So you can still experience symptoms of an underactive thyroid, even though you're within the range. So think the weight, the sluggishness, fatigue, cold hands, brittle nails, dry skin, dry hair, foggy mind, all of that. You can still experience that even though your thyroid is technically within the range. And this is where Hormone Health Studio comes into play, right? We dig a little bit deeper and make sure that, you know, your results are optimal, not just within range, but optimal. So that's me. If you want to follow more, you can find me on Instagram. Obviously, there's my email there if you want to touch base or have any questions. But that's it. Thank you.
Sorry, it took me a moment to come back.
I was like, hang on, is that me?
It was the tech. We'll blame the tech. Thank you, Georgia. That was an absolutely fabulous presentation. Really, really so information packed, and Yeah, I've love the way that you've really broken down into some simple things that we can do, immediately, just understanding what foods we can add in, some little changes that we can make, if we're perhaps not feeling our best at the moment that can help. So, yeah, thank you so much for a talk. We've got a bunch of questions that
Great.
our community, the drop-in, have sent through that we'll endeavour to get through in the next 30 minutes. And if we don't get to your question, we will endeavour to do some over the next couple of weeks. But please, if you're in the audience and you've been listening and watching and you have any questions, this is the time. So pop them in the chat box and I will read them out to Georgia. We've got one there that I'll kick off with from Sarah. So Sarah asked or said she would be grateful if, Georgia, you can set some expectations on how long it takes before a change of behavior and diet influences your hormone balance and feeling better.
Yeah, it's a good question. For some women who I see, it can be within the cycle. So, particularly if we're talking about PMS or painful periods or anything related to your period, you can get a result pretty quickly. However, if you also think about how long it takes for ovulation to occur, so that 100 days, I pre-frame everyone. Give it 100 days. Like, let's do. I for many women, they notice a difference within the month, like I mentioned, but it just gets better and better. So I think if you can give yourself 100 days to get that whole next round of ovulatory eggs and supporting that estrogen and progesterone, you'll notice a difference if you're on the right path.
And that 100 days is really, really interesting, and it's a great reminder of that, to kind of be able to cast your mind back a little bit further.
Mm.
Perhaps, would you recommend, tracking symptoms, keeping a diary
Yes.
so that you can start to get a bit more of a long-term view around what's going on?
Absolutely. There's a particular app that I like called Fertility Friend. It's not
Okay.
as user friendly as things like Flow. However, I like it because, for the women in my clinic, I get them to send me their login details and I can log in from a desktop and I can manage their charts as well. So rather than me asking you, okay, well, what was last cycle like? I can see exactly what's going on. And in an app like that, you can chart everything. You can chart your temperature, your cervical mucus, and any symptom under the sun: low mood, low energy, bloating, pain, whatever it may be. And the more you track, the more data, the better. It gives you such an insight into what those different hormones are doing at that different point in your cycle.
Well, that's great. We love an app recommendation. So that's Fertility Friend. We'll have a look and see if we can find a link and pop that up in our Facebook group today as well for anyone that's interested in that.
Right.
So thanks, Georgia. I'm going to jump to a few questions now that the drop-in have sent through.
Mm-hmm.
So the first question is, where do I go to get levels tested in more detail? So I think the question might be, is this something that a GP can generally do, or would it be seeing someone like yourself in order to get this full range testing done?
So, a great question. Either or, you have two options. You can visit your GP and they will want to know your symptoms. They'll want to know a full history. They won't like it if you say, my naturopath said that I want these tests done, as you can imagine. So that's option A, and you can see what they're willing to do. Option B, we can order any tests under the sun. They're just not covered on Medicare in Australia. So, for example, vitamin B12 is $30. Thyroid, you can get a pretty comprehensive thyroid panel for $35. It adds up pretty quickly. So if your GP is bulk billing you and it makes that process really easy, you can get basics done. Check your full blood count, check your liver function, your iron, the basics, and then anything that we need to dig deeper that your GP perhaps isn't willing to do, we can always do that privately.
Okay, great. Thank you. Another question in regards to testing that came through. Does genetic testing help to determine, well, the question is, does genetic testing help to determine the correct diet for an individual? But I guess it would be interesting to talk about genetics a
Yeah, I
little bit
haven't
as
touched
well.
that. So
Yeah.
genetics is a really key part of my practice. So there is an institute in Australia called the MTHFR Genomics, and I don't know, it's a long name. Anyway, I did my genetics training through there. They're cutting edge here in Australia. And when I test your genes, I'm really looking at how you're built. So I can see from your genetics, your estrogen metabolism genes, your liver function genes. I can see your antioxidant requirements, your predisposition to anxiety, depression, chronic fatigue. I can see histamine genes, which, to link that with your question, the original question, sorry, in terms of diet, for some women, I mean, I'm not big in dieting. I won't put anyone on a diet. However, if there's particular symptoms or a cluster of symptoms that make me think that there's something in the diet that's triggering that, such as histamines, knowing your histamine genes and then coupling that with a lower histamine diet for a couple of months or so can be great at turning symptoms around. And perhaps just to give you an insight into what histamine looks like in terms of symptoms, it moves with estrogen. So anything estrogen related, that could be heavy periods, painful periods, headaches, nausea, vomiting, but also histamine we often think of in terms of allergies and hay fever and itchy skin and watery eyes and sneezing. So I mean, many women have all of those symptoms, and often it's just triggered by histamine. So you can lower the histamine from a food standpoint and then support the genes that way.
Okay, great. Thank you. I'm jumping to a question now from Larissa in our audience who asks, do you have any generic advice for us older women in late 40s heading into or already in perimenopause?
Yes, actually, I have a great book recommendation.
Love a book recommendation.
This one here, there is a naturopathic doctor named Lara Bryden, and she has
Okay.
brought out a brand new book. I have no affiliation with this. I just think it's a fantastic book, Hormone Repair Manual, specific for women over 40s. So it talks everything about diet, lifestyle, stress. It's a fantastic recommendation. To give you a bit of an insight, though, particularly when you head towards perimenopause, menopausal years, you're juggling so many balls. There's often young kids or teenage kids, there's aging parents, you've got a career and a more, there's a lot going on at that point. So often stress is a really big factor, and so too is sleep or lack of or active mind. Also, thyroid dysfunction increases with age. So starting there, checking that thyroid to see what's going on, and other nutrients along the way, vitamin D, B12, iron, etc.
Okay, great. Thank you. Now, we've spoken a little bit about diet, or quite a bit about diet. How important is it when it comes to balancing hormones?
Super
How much of an
important.
impact? Yeah.
So let's talk about estrogen even. Estrogen alone. For estrogen to be metabolized and excreted out of the body so that there's not excess levels, it first goes to the liver and attaches to a little molecule called conjugation. And then that conjugated estrogen moves to the bowel and is excreted via the stool. However, if there is too much load on the liver, so think alcohol, caffeine, endocrine disrupting chemicals, which are the groups of chemicals found in perfumes and makeup and all of that sort of thing, or if you're dehydrated or you don't have enough protein, whatever it is that's causing that liver to be a bit sluggish, and or if you go to the bowel and there's constipation, there's bloating, diarrhea, pain, whatever the gut symptom may be, that conjugated estrogen becomes deconjugated, reactivated, and then reabsorbed into the bloodstream, increasing your estrogen levels even more. So again, think heavy periods, painful periods, endometriosis, PMS, headaches, all of those symptoms. Sure, they could be hormonal, but to support your hormones, you need to make sure that your liver's working and your gut's working, and that's diet.
I mean, we're eating 3 times a day at least. It's a pretty constant thing, and I guess it's all it's what we're running on, so it makes a
Mm,
lot of sense. Look, you just touched really briefly on endocrine disruptors. Can we
mhm.
just talk about that for a moment? Because I think there tends to be a bit of conversation around it, but often not a lot of explanation around exactly what the term means of endocrine
Yeah.
disruption and how we can kind of help avoid that.
Yes, definitely. So the endocrine system is a group of glands in the body, primarily the thyroid. The thyroid is a big gland in the endocrine system. Endocrine disrupting chemicals, or EDCs, are a group of chemicals and hundreds of chemicals that have been shown to disrupt the function of the endocrine system. And the research is quite scary that's coming out, really looking at the effects of these chemicals on not only our health, but particularly as women, and particularly as women who then conceive, the effects of the baby, and then how soon your daughter goes through puberty. Girls are going through puberty at like 7 and 8, and they're linking that with exposure to something in the womb during pregnancy, potentially endocrine disrupting
Wow.
chemicals. So while there's hundreds and hundreds of chemicals, I have a select few that are non-negotiable, everyone must avoid. So these are phthalates, which is a class of chemicals, um, parabens, bisphenols. Bisphenols we will recognize. BPA is a bisphenol, bisphenol A.
Right.
So they're obviously found in plastics, plastic anything. Even if you get BPA-free plastic products, they're just as problematic, because what the research shows is that instead of using bisphenol A, they're simply replacing it with bisphenol S, bisphenol F, bisphenol Z,
Oh,
etc.,
wow.
which have been shown to be just as problematic, particularly when it comes to estrogen. They're calling these groups of chemicals that act on estrogen obesogens, because they can, by binding to the estrogen receptor, contribute to obesity, which is phenomenal. You don't often think about your plastic water bottle contributing to weight gain.
Absolutely, no. The marketing, tends to say something else completely, with the health messaging. So, I mean, we've spoken about water bottles. I kind of get the feeling that these endocrine disruptors that you've spoken about, and the ones in particular on your banned list, are kind of everywhere.
So
Can you
think,
speak about some of the places you find them?
yeah,
Shampoo?
yeah.
Yeah.
And shampoo is probably the hardest one, particularly if
Yeah.
you dye your hair blonde like I do.
Hmm.
You kind of need the chemicals in there to stop it from turning green, right? So
Yeah.
I think
Ideally.
ideally,
Yeah.
ideally,
Now
uh,
Halloween is over. Yes.
I know. So it's hard, but I think at the same time, you can't possibly, you can't wrap yourself in bubble wrap. That'd be the worst thing because it's plastic, but you can't hide from these chemicals. All you can do is reduce your exposure where you can. So if you get your hair done every 6 weeks, great, enjoy it. And then, look to other things in your environment that contain these chemicals. So think makeup, think face wash and body wash, think deodorant and perfume, lathered in phthalates and parabens. So that's really where you can look. And then in terms of bisphenols, plastic water bottles, plastic food storage containers, any plastics in your kitchenware. I also kind of go as hard as when you get skincare, try and get that in glass also. It's hard to do. I mean, there's some great brands out there, and then they're in plastic, and you think, well, I don't know, what, I don't know how good this is.
Yeah, it's a
Um,
good point.
so, I mean, it can be overwhelming and scary, and you think, well, what's the point? We're all going to die anyway, which is a bit morbid. But you can do a lot, particularly in your household.
It seems like there's some easy swaps and then some that are
Mm.
a little bit difficult, but I guess understanding and being able to make the swaps where possible and educating yourself is key.
There's a particular website I should share. It's called
Okay.
Skin Deep. It's by the Environmental Working Group, who are a not for profit organization from the States. And Skin Deep is a website where you can search an individual ingredient if you're not sure, and it will tell you what the research says. Is it problematic? If so, how? What does the research show? So that's a really good resource, particularly if you're stuck.
That's amazing. Thank you so much. That's another resource we'll share with the community as well. We'll look that one up. What about supplements? Can we talk briefly, I know it might be a bit tricky, around supplements' role in balancing hormones?
Yeah. So when it comes to those three axes in particular, supplements work really well. I listed some of the key nutrients there. Magnesium's a big one, but also, I mean, probably 50% of my clinic is just fertility. Like that's all we do. So I have a whole host of supplements that I use to support, sure, the communication between the brain and the ovaries, but also egg quality, sperm quality, really optimizing the health of the egg and the sperm so that when they do meet, there's something that happens. So, what I'm just going to briefly explain what happens and then it'll make sense as to where I'm going. The DNA of the sperm is carried in the head, right? And when it penetrates the egg, it deposits that DNA into the egg. Then there's something in the egg called the mitochondria, which is in all of our cells all of the time. It's like the energy hub. But it's the mitochondria's responsibility to clean up all of the damaged DNA in the sperm and then in the egg. We're cleaning up, from the very get-go from them, right? Anyway, that's a whole nother conversation. But
So fascinating.
what we can do is by supporting sperm quality, takes the pressure off the egg to clean it up, and then we can really focus on egg quality as well. And then there's a nice healthy fertilization, a nice healthy embryo, a nice healthy baby. So that's where supplements come in key, because you just cannot get the levels of these particular nutrients from food.
So interesting. And so I guess looking at men's health as part of that picture as well, and looking at some of those dietary supplements or dietary swaps or, tweaks is super important as well.
Particularly, I think, when it comes to either miscarriage or not getting, like infertility, not getting pregnant, nothing happening. Because what can happen if there is miscarriage, 50% of miscarriages are caused by male factors alone. And we don't often consider that, because we think it's our body. If we something's failed in my body that stopped that pregnancy from being viable. However, 50% caused by male factors alone. So we need to investigate them, particularly when it comes to fertility. When it comes to not getting pregnant at all, like just nothing happening, something called sperm antibodies can happen, whereby there's the sperm and you get all these antibodies around it that basically stop it from penetrating the egg. Therefore, nothing is happening. So, I think we take a lot of pressure on ourselves, particularly in the realm of fertility, but they play just as big a role.
Okay. I had a few questions around PMS. The first one that I will ask of you is, what is the best way to manage or prevent bloating at that time of the month, and why does it happen?
So I actually see digestive symptoms pop up in women with endometriosis. So endometriosis is an inflammatory condition that's driven by estrogen. So 50% of women will experience symptoms, which is pain. Painful periods, painful intercourse, painful defecation, pelvic pain just at random points throughout the cycle. And 50% of women will be asymptomatic, no symptoms at all. What can happen with endometriosis is that, because the whole condition is, there's lining of the endometrium that's elsewhere outside of the uterus, it can be attached to the bowel. And so then you can get symptoms like IBS type symptoms, fluctuations from diarrhea, constipation, bloating, whatever it may be. And it could simply be nothing digestive. It's all coming back to the endometriosis. They call it the endo belly. You can probably search that hashtag on Instagram and you'll see all of these bellies that look 6 months pregnant.
Yeah.
But in fact, it's just the endometriosis.
And it's 1 in 10, I think, women.
Yeah. And
have
you know
endo.
what? I think that's probably underdiagnosed. The only way you can diagnose it is through surgery. I mean, it's not a simple blood test.
Pretty invasive.
It's
Yeah.
incredibly invasive. So women often go 10 plus years. They're often diagnosed with IBS first, and then 10 years later, it'll actually be, oh, hang on, this is endometriosis.
Yeah, wow. We had a question come through from Luong, which I'm not sure. I might need a bit more information. The question is how emergency pills affect my hormones. So I'm wondering if that's the morning after pill, potentially.
Yep. So, I mean, in that time, it's what you need to do, right? So, and I often see the effects being transient, in that it'll last, maybe it'll take you a few more weeks than usual to get your next period. And maybe that next period will be heavier or more painful. And that's just a part of that journey. But I don't see that lasting long term. I do see, however, when you get a DNC, so say you're pregnant and don't want to keep the pregnancy, but you're too far along for the pill to work and they need to kind of go in and scoop out the product. Sometimes the scooping out, the DNC can affect your lining, which can then have long-term implications. However, I see many women who have experienced that and go on to conceive healthy babies.
Okay, thank you. That was actually a very, very interesting question. Thank you, Long. Another question from Angela in the audience, who asks, what supplements and dietary advice do you have for menopausal symptoms like hot flushes and mood swings?
Magnesium, step number 1. Often I will give a magnesium supplement, sure, through the diet, but particularly when it comes to menopause, I think supplementation, it's much more effective quickly. But magnesium, I find really great for hot flushes, for insomnia, and for the mood swings in particular.
Okay, excellent. Yes, I'm a big fan of magnesium, just as a sleep aid, really. I feel super relaxed when I take it.
Yeah, well, in fact, there's different forms, right? Maybe I'll just touch on that as well. So you can get
please do.
there's a magnesium citrate, which can be quite good if you have constipation or any digestive issues. The citrate's quite nice for the digestive system. However, if it's more, cognitive, neurological, stress, anxiety, insomnia, it's all up here. A glycinate, the glycine, when it's attached to the magnesium, is really calming for the nervous system. So, particularly from a supplement standpoint, a magnesium glycinate's quite nice in the menopausal years.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. We've had quite a few people ask prior to today and today as well, about you, Georgia, and the services that you offer. So I know that very recently you've had a very exciting rebrand to the Hormone Health Studio. Can you talk a little bit about your setup there, and if you are taking online consults at the moment?
So we are completely online at the moment. I think
Mhm.
if there's one thing that COVID taught us, it was that we were able to just step back and offer our services online, which is really nice. I'm based in Newcastle in New South Wales, and we're looking at opening a clinic space next year, which is super exciting. But in the meantime, we're exclusively online. At the moment, it is me, and I have another couple of naturopaths who are coming on board very soon, which is exciting. In terms of the types of conditions we treat, I mean, like I said, kind of 50% of my fertility, my clinic is fertility. Anything related to the preconception, to pregnancy, to the postpartum journey. I just kind of see mums all the time. I do also a lot of PCOS and endometriosis, which often comes into the fertility picture anyway. But think any of those hormonal conditions, love it. Bring it on.
Excellent. And in case that you're completely inundated and someone isn't able to book in with you online, do you have any advice for people in Australia in terms of being able to find a good evidence-based naturopath like yourself?
Yeah. So, in terms of my books, I think I have about a 6 week wait list at the moment. So, even if you're thinking and maybe now's not the time, perhaps booking something that far in advance will suit you anyway. Hence why I'm getting more naturopaths on. But in terms of being an evidence based practitioner, so back in the day, to become a naturopath, it was like, I don't know, a short course. It was a diploma, maybe, wasn't very
Mm.
intensive. Nowadays, it's a 4 year bachelor health degree, and they teach you from a very science based background. So if you visit like an old school naturopath, I mean, they just practice so differently. It's so beautiful. They do drop dosing and they're really into the herb. Like, it's just so different. But nowadays, if you're looking for that more evidence-based approach, which I think when you make such beautiful work with your clients and you want to be at the level of, what their GP can do, and you want to be respected on that level as well, you need to be backing yourself with the evidence. And there's plenty of it.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Look, I think that is pretty much all that we have time for. There's no more questions that have come through from our audience, and we're probably at about time anyway. So we may just leave it there for today. Georgia, I just wanted to say thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure having you at the